Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to the webinar called Unlocking Freedom: How Biking Builds Independent Kids and Teens. Welcome. This is put on by the League of American Bicyclists. So I hope you're in the right place. We have a great group of presenters today to share information, research, stories, and insights. So we're so glad you're here to hear that information and answer questions, hear comments. Thank you for being here. I'm going to start with a few quick announcements before we get started, and then we'll introduce Rick Holt, who is our moderator, and then Rick will be introducing our panelists. So, okay, quick reminders. This is being recorded, so we will have this for available to the public afterwards. You can find the recording in two different places at bikeleague.org/webinars or on the Bike League's YouTube channel, which has an abundance of great videos, educational videos, and more there. So if you've never been there, check it out. We'd love to have you see those videos. Closed captioning is available on the with this webinar. So you just have to um, do that on your device. All attendees are muted, just as a way to cut down on distraction. So we appreciate your you being on mute. Sorry. I know people like to jump in, and we do like having conversations. But at the end we'll kind of open it up to question and answer, and we'll address questions then. And then anytime during the presentation, just type your question in the Zoom chat. We'll be keeping track of those and be able to answer those at the end. Hopefully, I think we'll have a lot of time, so we'll get to those, hopefully all of them. Okay, I know a lot of you are very familiar with the League of American Bicyclists, but just give you a refresher of who the League of American Bicyclists is. We are a national nonprofit advocacy organization working for better bicycling across the U.S. Our mission is to create a bicycle-friendly America for everyone. We're a really old organization. We've been around a long time, since 1880. And we've been improving lives and strengthening communities through bicycling throughout that long length of time. Our approach is to advocate and amplify voices at all levels, federal, state, and local level, for more investments, policies, programs that make bicycling safe, comfortable, and accessible for everyone. We educate and promote best practices. This webinar is a great example of promoting research and best practices. That includes educating drivers on sharing the road with cyclists in a safe and responsible way, and to increase opportunities for people to bike more, just to have the option of biking. We support and showcase the movement of change makers. A great panel of change makers right here. And I know all of you are change makers as well. So showcasing as much advocacy, great work, and education that's going on across the country. Our programs, National Bike Summit, we just finished the 2026 National Bike Summit. It was a lot of fun and very inspiring. That's part of our federal advocacy approach. We have our programs of a bicycle-friendly America, which include communities, businesses, universities, and states. And then, of course, my favorite, Smart Cycling, which is our cycling education class or program. And then a quick reminder that we have an amazing webinar series throughout the year. And you can find that at bikeleague.org/webinars. Our next one is happening May 5th. and it's talking about grants. It's like a grants 101, getting started, where to find them, how to apply, Safe Streets for All grant program. We love and encourage people applying for those grants because the money's there. We just gotta put it to use. Okay, so now back to the why you're all here, unlocking freedom and how biking builds independent kids and teens. I'm going to introduce Rick Holt, who will then introduce our three panelists. And Rick, a good friend, a great mentor of mine throughout the years. Love seeing Rick at conferences and around DC. Rick Holt is the co-founder of Early Childhood Mobility Coalition, kidswalkbike.com, and which is focused on mobility of children 8 and younger. Rick is a Safe Streets advocate and a League of American Bicyclists certified instructor. He has completed research on children's physical activity and traffic gardens. Currently, Rick is focused on the benefits of children's play, independent mobility, and intergenerational mobility in kids on balance bikes. Rick is a grandparent who enjoys spending time outdoors on bikes with his granddaughters and is working to bring traffic gardens and bike buses to Cincinnati, Ohio. So thanks, Rick, for moderating this panel, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Allison, and I appreciate it. And I want to thank the League, too, for bringing this topic to the forefront so we can talk about independent mobility. So we have a great panel assembled for you today to talk about the importance of children's independent mobility. And the panel will deliver content focused on the benefits and factors associated with biking and independent mobility, as well as interventions to support those. So the panel we have today, Dr. Richard Larouche is an associate professor of public health at the University of Lethbridge in Alberta, Canada. He is currently the principal investigator of a 17-country study that aims to develop and validate the app-based Global Adolescent and Child Physical Activity Questionnaire so we can gather more data. His research interests include active transportation, physical activity, outdoor play, independent mobility, sustainability, and climate change. Richard is the editor of the book Children's Active Transportation, published by Elsevier in 2018, and co-founder and board member of Outdoor Play Canada. And I get to see photos of him occasionally on Blue Sky, looking out there, hiking and biking out in the western part of Canada. So great. Dr. Esther Walker. Esther started cycling for transportation while working towards her PhD in cognitive science at the University of California, San Diego, and has not been able to put down a bike since. At Outride, she is able to combine her background in human cognition and data science with her passion for getting people excited about riding bikes, be it for transportation, recreation, racing, or anything in between. She leads efforts to scale research-backed programs, grants, and partnerships that expand access to riding, strengthen community well-being, and build welcoming long pathways into bicycling. Her work with the Outride team focuses on ensuring that the benefits of bicycling reach communities everywhere. And Megan Ramey is the Safe Routes to Schools manager for Hood River County, Oregon, and a lifetime advocate for kids-centered transportation. After a decade of walking, biking, and sharing her family's story to push for safer streets, she founded Bike About to document North America's best biking experiences. In 2020, she launched the bike train at her daughter's school that sparked a cultural shift in how students get to school. Today, she leads the Safe Routes to Schools efforts in Hood River, advancing demonstration projects and programs like bike buses and school-based ideas to bring joy and independence back to everyday travel. So join me. I'm going to have the presentation to talk about independent mobility, and we'll start off with Dr. Larouche. Richard?
Thank you for the introduction. Just a second here. Right, so I'm going to be talking about research on children's independent mobility and active transportation. And you might think that this strike represent not quite the age group that we're talking about, but there will be a story to that point that will come near the end of my presentation. First of all, I would like to acknowledge that there has been a large decline in children's independent mobility that has been observed over the last few decades and even last century in the case of the United States. And this is an example that came up in a newspaper in the UK a while ago. So just to illustrate how independent mobility decreased across generations. So the larger polygon that you can see illustrates the mobility of the great-grandfather who was allowed to go 6 miles on his own to go fishing. And you see with each successive generation, the amount of independent mobility becomes smaller up to the great-grandson who is only allowed to travel 300 yards on their own. And this also aligns with seminal research that was conducted in the UK, suggesting a large decline in the proportion of children allowed to walk or bike from school on their own between 1971 and 1990. And this is not unique to the UK, so similar declines have been observed in a range of countries, including the United States, Australia, and other countries in Europe as well. And this is concerning because independent mobility is associated with more use of active transportation, so walking and biking and using other sustainable modes to go from place to place, as well as lower physical activity. And there was also a major paper that came up about 3 years ago suggesting that the decline in children's independent mobility might be one of the causes of the recent increase in mental health disorders among children. So this was published in the Journal of Pediatrics, and the authors cited research about the decline in independent mobility and discussed that at the same time there was this increase in disorders such as anxiety and depression and even suicide over the last few decades. However, longitudinal evidence was lacking to provide support for the hypothesis that was made in this paper. So when I first read this paper, I realized that I was sitting on data that I could use to answer this question. So we conducted during the pandemic a longitudinal study with parents across Canada, so over 2,000 parents at baseline in December 2020. That was in the second wave of the COVID-19 pandemic, so the study was conducted online. And that study involved parents of 7 to 12 years old who were invited for follow-ups every 6 months until June 2022. And the study focused on independent mobility, active transportation, as well as movement behaviors in children and not adolescents, but also parents. And we used two different measures of independent mobility. So the first one is the mobility licenses that were developed by Ailman and colleague in the UK. And they correspond to 6 permissions for children to do activities on their own, which includes cycling on main roads as one of the 6 licenses, as you can see on this screen. So that was one of the measures of independent mobility. The other was involved asking parents how far their children could travel on their own without adult supervision. And we had those 3 categories that we used for our analysis. Now, moving on to what we found. So we found that the percentage of parents who expressed that their child experienced distress was quite high throughout the pandemic. It declined a little bit, but remained quite high throughout the period. And we saw an increase in independent mobility both when looking at the licenses as well as looking at how far children can go on their own. However, we found no association between mobility licenses and the distress that was experienced by the children. But we did find an association when we look at how far children were allowed to go on their own. So when we compare children who were allowed to go over 15 minutes away from their house on their own compared to those who were allowed less than 5 minutes, they were close to 40% less likely to experience distress. And this was the case even when we control for a number of other variables that could be associated with distress, such as child's gender, age, household income, whether they attended school in person or online in the context of the pandemic, and whether they had been in isolation for COVID-19 in the week before the survey. So we also assess active transportation as part of this study, and on this slide you see the percentage of boys and girls who used active versus motorized mode of transportation to get to and from schools. So for both boys and girls, it was just under 40% that were using active transportation. We don't have specific estimates for cycling because that's a very small minority in Canada. Typically around 1 or 2% of kids will use cycling for transportation, unfortunately. And when we look at the factors that are associated with active transportation in this cohort of participants, we found that the boys and girls who had the permission to travel home from school on their own were about 10 to 12 times more likely to engage in active transportation. So quite a large association there. And we also found that children whose parents use active transportation to get to and from work were more likely to use active transportation to school. So that illustrates the role that parents' behavior can have on their children. And in another study that we did in 3 diverse regions of Canada, we look at association between parents' independent mobility and active transportation, as well as their children's independent mobility and active transportation. And what we found was that the older a parent was allowed to travel alone as a child, the less independent mobility their child has. So this suggests that this could be one of the factors that contribute to the intergenerational decline in independent mobility on the one hand. But if you look at it from another perspective, it could suggest that if we are successful in increasing the independent mobility of our children today, there could be benefits for future generations. We also found that girls whose parents biked to work had higher independent mobility, and we found that independent mobility increased with age in both boys and girls, which is a very typical finding in the literature. So independent mobility tends to be associated with parent perceived maturity of the child. And we often think about the risk when it comes to independent mobility. So parents are often concerned about risk related to traffic as well as risk related to crime or this perception of stranger danger, which often comes up in survey. But I think it is also useful to remind us that there are risks of not granting independent mobility. So and doing that can be a bit like removing the training wheels from the bikes for our children. So there are known risks. It's likely that the child will fall a few times before they're able to bike on only 2 wheels. But there are also benefits that comes with doing that. And so that was inspired by a quote from the participants in one of our recent quantitative study exploring factors related to independent mobility in the context of southern Alberta here in Canada. So that's what I have to present today. I'm looking forward to answer any questions that you may have.
We answer questions right now, or we're going to wait till the end?
I think why don't we wait till the end?
I thought so, yes. There's
Yeah.
one in the chat, there's one in the Q&A that you can look at probably, Richard, and answer as well.
Right, so I guess I'll jump in as speaker number 2 here. Thank you all, and thank you so much, Richard, for that wonderful presentation. I think it builds on some of the work here. So my name's as Rick said, Esther Walker. I'm the executive director at Outride, and today I'm going to talk a little bit more about a slightly older age group, kind of moving into that middle school level. And so as many of you know, and especially those of you in education or those of you who have teenagers, over 40% of teenagers are spending over 8 hours a day in front of screens, and that's not including their time at school on computers. We also know, as Richard mentioned, that fewer youth are being active, fewer youth are meeting physical activity recommendations, and fewer people are spending time outside. I know this is a stat that's coming from adults, but we see similar trends with youth in terms of just the limited number or limited amount of time that we spend outdoors in nature. And all of this kind of comes back to kind of this bigger question, which is around this decline in our mental health as well as cognitive decline, exactly as Richard mentioned. And there are many contributing factors to that. Physical activity, one of them. But across each of these different kind of challenges, cycling has presented itself as a really powerful tool to address those challenges. And, given the power that cycling can have, it's been really surprising to see just how, limited the number of people that are able to, walk and bike for active transportation, as well as in their communities. And we can see this in some of the national level data as well. So for example, in the last round of the People for Bikes participation study, the last one was 2024, we see that actually, by the time you hit 18 to 24, there's that, decrease in how often that you're able to pick up a bike. We did see a slight uptick in this last round of survey, which is promising. But I also want to kind of add some nuance here, which this data actually is only showing at least 1 day of riding. So it's not actually much of a high bar for participation in cycling. And so if you take a deeper dive and say, okay, of those who rode, which is already a pretty small amount, how often did they ride? And we actually see that, over the years, the percentage of students and percentage of youth that are regularly riding is decreasing. And so I think there's a lot of work to be done. And I know many on the call here are, directly involved with that. And I know Richard alluded to some of these, but, when we think about, okay, how are we going to get, more youth riding? What's contributing to that participation? We know that there's many, many factors involved across many different levels, from the individual level, what is your motivation to get out and get on a bike, to are your friends doing it? Is it something your family does? Are there safe streets in your community? As well as, for some schools, even maybe there's actually a policy that says you're not allowed to ride your bike to school. And so all of these different factors across levels ultimately contribute to that cycling participation. And we also know that, that there's not equitable access to infrastructure, to programs, to equipment. And so there's, many different ways there that we can intervene to ultimately increase cycling participation. And so at Outride, if you're not familiar with our work, we're a nonprofit. Really, we focus on empowering people to experience those social, emotional, and cognitive benefits that can come along with cycling. And really, we do that through 3 main program areas. So the first is research, really understanding the evidence base around the impact of cycling. And then really, our programs help put that research into action, largely through our middle school-based program, Riding for Focus, which I'll talk about. But then also, as we just saw on that previous slide, knowing that there are so many factors that contribute beyond the school day, we also have a community impact grant opportunity that allows community-based organizations to apply for funding to support after-school clubs, or maybe supporting a local bike park, or maintenance workshops, and really to help kind of build up the supports around what's really going to encourage people to ride and keep riding. From the research side, we've been engaged with a number of different, academics as well as community partners, from pretty basic level research on, the impact of, just getting on a bike on brain activity, all the way to more applied work on, what is it that motivates a student who's exposed to cycling during the school day to continue to ride beyond that. And if you also look, beyond just, program specific work, and I know Richard touched a little bit on this, and look at the broader research that's been done around not just cycling, but physical activity, as well as physical activity programs. So programs that are able to kind of get youth out moving together. There's an immense body of evidence about kind of all the positive impacts that can come with that. And for those of you who really want to dive into the research, I'm happy to send along some references here as well. But I know many of you that run programs might resonate with a lot of these benefits. So for example, particularly when you're working with a group of students, we've seen increased social connection, sense of belonging. Really, for many of the students, that's the first opportunity that they're speaking to friends or, peers that they would not normally have talked to during the school day. You also see great benefits for self-confidence and building resilience. Biking can be a hard skill, learning to shift, learning to, climb up a hill, and the resilience that comes with it. There's a lot of skills that can be built based on those experiences as well. And then I think, what's really important given kind of the current landscape for youth mental health and indeed mental health across the whole lifespan, is the association between, cycling and physical activity and improved mood, reduced stress, reduced depressive symptoms. The youth literature, there's less clear evidence on anxiety, but as a whole, there's great benefits to getting youth out moving on that mental health side as well. Another key area of focus, which is where, Outride initially got started, is around executive function. So that's kind of a, fancy way of saying, our ability to focus, pay attention, ignore distractions. Many of those skills that, come with, being able to focus, during the school day, focus on your work, things like that. And so you see kind of an increasing, body of research looking at that relationship between physical activity and executive function as well. And then finally, for those who are really, into the brain science side of things, is that there's been an incredible work looking across the lifespan, including with youth, on both structural and functional changes to the brain that can happen through physical activity and cycling, including increased volume of the hippocampus, an area associated with learning and memory, as well as improved white matter tracts. And so altogether, I'm probably speaking to the choir here, but there are, immense benefits to be had to engage youth in more physical activity, and cycling is a really powerful way to do that. And so ultimately, to help increase access to cycling, Outride has been running the Riding for Focus program since 2014. And really since then have engaged with over 400 middle schools across the US and Canada. And really the goal there is to equip students with basic cycling skills and, it really introduce them to the activity of cycling. They may not love it. Maybe at middle school, not everyone's going to love everything all the time, but at least you're equipping them with a skill they can use throughout, their entire life. And really, I think the important component of the program is also just allowing students to experience that joy and community that can come with cycling that, I see so much in Megan's work as well with the bike bus, is just kind of that community that's built up above and beyond the physical activity portion. And really the program, we provide it as a grant opportunity. So schools are able to apply for the grant and receive a fleet of bikes, helmets, teacher training, and curriculum. And really it's been designed to be adapted and implemented across many different settings. Again, we know that there's inequitable access to, infrastructure depending on where you're located across the country. So we really encourage schools to use what they have. So you might see, actually in the depths of the winter in British Columbia here, riding in the gym to get those basic skills down, to tennis courts, to, soccer fields, to even working up to riding on the road and trails. And really, again, the goal is to, introduce students to, how to ride safely, how to ride with each other. And I think this is so important. I know we were talking earlier that, the topic of e-bikes will come up, but, providing this baseline of education of, the rules of the road, basic safety practices, and respect for one another on the bike can go so far in kind of laying that foundation when you do ride beyond the school day. One thing I also do want to call out is, across our data that we see from our schools, this is now over 4 years, we continue to see the same trends, now looking at over, 10,000 students in this set. Even when we take into account, sleep, gender, socioeconomic status, and other physical activity, we consistently see that the students who ride at least once a week report higher levels of mental well-being than those who ride less regularly, and of course, especially than those who never ride. And when you kind of dig into, well, what is it about the bike? A lot of what we see is, maybe what a lot of you experience when you go out for a bike ride. It's about just, feeling the wind in the face, the peer connection, that social connection comes up a lot. So riding with classmates, learning learning about someone's life story that you would not have otherwise come across with, especially in a school setting. That fun component, learning, building confidence, and I think importantly, being outside. The number of students who mention that they just get to be outside, experience nature in a new way, experience their community in a new way, all tends to be really surprising, given that, more and more students are spending, 8 hours a day inside, in the chair at the desk. And so providing that opportunity to just go out and experience fresh air and that sense of freedom, if only for an hour, has been so powerful for them. Again, this kind of is reiterating a little bit of what I just said, but I think, again, when you think about this age group, we're talking about middle school, they're really forming those social connections. And so that peer connection is really important in influencing, what they want to do, whether that's, ride a bike, where they want to ride, how they want to ride. And so it's incredibly important, I think, to keep that in mind as you're kind of dealing with that age group. One other thing I would like to call out, because we're talking about, independent mobility as well, is that, only 6% of students, reported riding to school in this data set. Many schools at 0%. I will say that's pretty high for an average, and it tends to be because these are schools who are already actively engaged in wanting to get, cycling programs going. But there's a gap between who actually does it and who is, interested in riding. And so when you think about that gap, the top barriers that students are highlighting is, one is distance, it's too far. That differs whether it's, we're working with a really rural community versus more kind of dense urban area. But really, the top two we see are around cars and parent permission. And so I think that really speaks to us about, how we as kind of a coalition of organizations and communities can really address those two to really, help more students actually, increase their access to cycling and the benefits that can come with that. So again, as I said, I know many of you know the benefits of biking here, but the data is really strong in terms of cycling as a tool and physical activity as a tool to support your social, emotional, and cognitive health. We've seen that the school-based programs, can really increase reach of these programs, particularly for underserved areas. But I think there's still a really important gap of, introducing cycling versus being able to actually engage in it in your community. And that's really going to require strong focus on, safe routes, infrastructure, along with both structured and unstructured opportunities for youth to engage with cycling. So thank you all for your attention here. Happy to answer questions along with the panel. And again, if you want to learn more about our work, it's our website there. But I'd also, encourage you to look into our grant opportunities as well. So thank you. And with that, I think I'll pass it over to Megan.
Can everybody hear me? Am I good? Okay. So hi y'all. My name is Megan Ramey. I'm the Safe Routes to School Manager for Hood River County School District. And fair warning, I might have a kitty or two that joins me on my desk. So hopefully it's not distracting. All right. So I want to start with this. Free-range godmother Lenore Skenazy and anxious generation godfather Jonathan Haidt asked kids how to get them off their phones. And their number one answer was simple: freedom to play in my neighborhood. That's what they're asking for. And that's what this work is all about, not just biking or walking, but giving kids back their freedom. So the story I'm about to tell is a common one I see. Just 2 days ago, I was walking a friend to the bus stop in Hood River when I ran into Lincoln, an eighth grader and former member of our 80s walk and roll club. He lit up and gave me a hug like always and said, "Are you riding the bus with me?" And I told him no, but my friend was. And a moment later, his mom, Kimmy, walked up and shared that Lincoln was heading to Portland, 60 miles away, to see his dad. And then she said something that really stuck with me. She told my friend that before the bike club, they would have never imagined giving Lincoln that kind of independence, or even thought of the bus as an option for him. And now here he was, confident, capable, and on his way. And that's what this work is about, not just getting kids to school, but helping them realize they can go anywhere. So after hearing Lincoln's story, it would be easy to think he's the exception, but he's not. What we've learned in Hood River is that kids are far more capable than we give them credit for. They want independence, they're curious, they're ready to explore. And the real barriers aren't the kids, it's the system around them. It's the streets that feel unsafe. It's families who don't have access to bikes or skills. It's the perception that independence is risky instead of something to build toward. And when all those things stack up, the default becomes drive your kid everywhere. So instead of asking, are kids ready for independence, we started asking a different question, which is, have we created the conditions to allow them to succeed? Because when we do, when access, experience, and the environment come together, kids don't just participate, they thrive. So how do we start changing that system? In Hood River, we made a deliberate shift. We stopped leading with safety and started leading with joy, sparked by the bike train in 2020. Because the truth is, kids don't show up for safety messaging. They show up for their friends, for music, for something that feels like it's theirs. And once they're there, once they're engaged, that's when everything else becomes possible. That's when they build skills. That's when confidence grows. That's when independence starts to take root. Joy lowers the barrier to entry. It creates a sense of belonging. And it turns what could feel intimidating into something kids actually want to do. So instead of asking, how do we teach kids to be safe, which is the normal thing, we ask, how do we create something that they can't wait to be a part of? Because joy isn't extra, it's the starting point. One of the most powerful ways we build independence is through biking field trips in their PE class, not in a parking lot, not in a controlled environment, on real streets, going to real places. We ride to parks, the neighborhood around their schools, local destinations, places that matter in the kids' daily lives. And along the way, they're not just learning how to ride a bike, they're learning how to navigate their world, how to choose a route, how to ride with others, how to make decisions in real time. And one thing that's been really important, especially for students who are hesitant, is how we group the kids. I can't emphasize this part enough. So we group by ability level, so beginners aren't trying to keep up with more confident riders. That creates space for kids, often girls who are more cautious at first, to build skills and confidence at their own pace. You can see it in moments like all of these students who start out unsure, even scared, and then by the end, they're riding, smiling, and realizing they can do it. That transformation doesn't come from telling kids what to do. It comes from giving them the right environment to try. And it comes because independence isn't something we wait until kids are ready for. It's something they become ready for by practicing. So if bike field trips are where independence is practiced, the 80s Walk and Roll Club is where it becomes part of who kids are. This program works because it's not just about getting from point A to point B, it's about culture. There's music and style and energy, and it feels different from anything else in their day, and that's intentional. Because when something feels fun, kids want to come back. And when they come back week after week, something deeper starts to happen. They build friendships, they build routines, they start to see themselves as someone who walks or rides, and it becomes part of their identity. And that's when we see this real shift, when kids start choosing to walk or bike outside the program, not because they have to, but because it's who they are. We're not just building habits, we're building a culture kids want to belong to. So when we take a step back and look what's actually making the difference in Hood River County, it really comes down to three things. First is access. If a kid doesn't have a bike or gear or way to participate, nothing else matters. We have to remove those barriers so every kid can show up. And then second is experience, not just theory, not just instruction, but real world riding over and over again. That's where confidence is built. And third is trust. And this might be the hardest one for us adults, but we have to take a step back, just enough to let kids try and struggle a little and succeed on their own. Because independence doesn't happen when everything is controlled. It happens when kids are given space to grow into it. So access, experience, and trust. When these three things come together, everything starts to shift. I was struck by this when I looked at it was like the first slide that Richard showed, where the grandfather had been given like 7 miles to go fishing. Like that's the part, like we have to be able to trust our kids to go do what they want to do. So what does this look like in practice? We're seeing more kids choosing to walk and bike to school, not because they have to, but because they want to. We're seeing confidence grow. Kids who once needed an adult are now navigating routes, making decisions, and helping their peers. You see in this top right photo, these 3 kids that are biking to school together side by side. I think that is like one of the strongest indications of when you know it's working. We're hearing from families who are starting to shift their mindset from that's too risky to you've got this. And we're seeing something bigger too. As more kids are out there moving independently, the community starts to notice. That builds momentum for safer streets, better infrastructure, and more support for this work. It becomes this positive cycle. Kids gain independence, families build trust, and communities respond, and it starts to reinforce itself. That's when you know it's working. So these photos are from 2 events. First is International Walk and Roll to School Day last year, and the second one is just last week for Dolores Huerta Walk to School Day. And this is Odell, is a community of about 3,000 people home to orchard packing houses and migrant families from Mexico. And in this one moment, you kind of see everything. Families showing up. Over 100 families usually show up for this event. Kids walking and biking together, and then cars moving alongside them on a road that wasn't really designed for all of this. And the demand is there. We don't have to convince these families to care about safe routes to school. They're already out here doing it. And what's missing is infrastructure that matches their reality. This isn't about creating demand, it's about responding to it and making sure the kids who need it most are safe doing what they're already choosing to do. And this is like selfishly advocacy brain, my favorite part about the whole thing. What you just saw isn't the end of the story, it's the beginning. When kids show up like this in numbers in the street, something shifts. They're not just participants anymore. They start to notice things. They start to ask questions, and they start to speak up and use their voice. We've seen students point out unsafe crossings, gaps in sidewalks, places where they feel confident and where they don't. And when kids speak in that context, after showing up like this, people listen very differently. But the biggest shift is in the kids themselves. They go from navigating their environment to realizing they can actually help shape it. And that's the moment independence turns into leadership. They're not just getting to school, they're helping build the community that they move through. So I want to bring this to life through one student, Genesis. 3 years ago, she was like so many kids in Hood River. I would actually say this is 5 years ago now. No real access, no clear pathway to independence. And then step by step, she learned to ride in PE, got a free bike from me, joined the after school club I run, and started showing up in her community. And then something changed. She didn't just ride, she spoke up. She helped engage neighbors around a demonstration project at her school. She became part of shaping the very streets she rides on. And then one day while we were biking together, she said, I never thought this would be my life. And so that's the shift. When kids gain independence, they don't just move through the community, they begin to lead it. I run into Genesis's mom all the time, and she just profusely thanks me for how Genesis has, like, how confident she has grown into. So if there's one thing I hope you can take from Little Hood River County, it's this. You don't need perfect infrastructure to start. You don't need a fully built network or a big grant or a long timeline. You just need a starting point. One ride, like the little 2020 bike train, one group of kids, one moment where a child realizes I can do this, because that's how independence begins. Not all at once, but step by step, and those small moments add up. They build confidence, they shift family norms, they create community momentum. So wherever you are, whatever your context, start small, start now, because when kids are given even a little space to move independently, they take it farther than we expect. And so just in over 5 years from my role as a mom advocate to Safe Routes to School manager, here's what's happened in Hood River. Our Safe Routes to School coalition has secured almost $10 million in grants. We've turned 3 demonstration projects into permanent infrastructure, including our most recent school street. We've led more than 800 bike and walk buses, donated 300 bikes to students who need them, taught 200 kids how to ride a bike for the first time, and over 3,400 students from kindergartner through ninth grade have ridden bikes in their PE class. And while those numbers matter, what they really represent is, I think, something bigger. And that's more kids with freedom, more families saying yes, and a community that's starting to believe this is possible. I am humbled to follow both Richard and Esther, and I thank you so much. Here's our website and socials, and wish me luck, as tomorrow I'm doing a district-wide Bike Bus for Earth Day challenge for all 9 schools, and fingers crossed we get some good turnout. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Megan. Thank you all for a great presentation. And the questions we have come in really started out with how to have that engagement to address accessibility and inclusion. I know one question came up, Richard, about data for your research and how children with disabilities were included, or if they were included in that. And then there was a couple other questions looking at how do we engage people in diverse social economic populations so we can actually address their concerns about safety as we move forward with these options. But Megan addressed some of that, I believe. But if you all want to address that, Richard, you want to start off with the inclusion aspect of it on the data?
Yes, thank you for the question. So in all of our study, we included children with disabilities or chronic conditions. Typically, we make our as few as possible exclusion criteria. I want to be as inclusive as I can. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of children with specific disabilities, so we can say, for example, this applies to children who are using wheelchair, or this applies to children with ADHD, or etc. But they were definitely included.
Include those diverse. Oh, go ahead, Megan. Sorry.
Yeah, in terms of, I would say, Odell, that I showed the slide of, they, I think are 60% Latino, 40% white, and there's no other sort of community or city that I work with that has the biggest turnout. And this is like a perfect example of if you offer it, the latent demand is there. Especially when I show up with my truck full of free bikes for kids, it's like the community like automatically like trusts you. So and then just offering education and PE class and then the walk and roll to school days. I will say that their PTO has like 9 just like take no prisoner moms that are like rolling out the red carpet with all the snacks and hot chocolate and coffee for the parents and the kids. And it's like it makes a huge difference in turnout. So yeah.
And I would also just add, I think that, for a lot of our work, particularly working with schools, I think introducing it through the school day has been this really kind of, you know, interesting phenomenon in that, maybe there's not a lot of cycling happening in the community, but, the program's been developed in such a way that they're, progressively building their skills. And so there's kind of in that, kind of really trying to tackle some of these, questions about, is it safe to ride a bike? What if I fall and, managing the equipment. And so being able to make sure that each student is able to progress through those before they kind of riding any more difficult or before they're exposed to traffic or anything like that can be just really important because it also means that you're reaching all students. You're not just relying on, students whose parents have a bike at home or, who've learned, from, being able to have access. And I think that's been huge. And then they're ready to go on to do additional programs like, the incredible things that, Megan's been working on. And so I think that's it is like, we have to start somewhere, really kind of build up that trust and safety and build from there. And then one other thing I'll also add in just terms of kind of, the adaptive side as well is that we've worked with a lot of schools and each school will have a different need of trying to make sure that all students truly are included. And so it can vary state by state, but there's additional, grant support for often these adaptive bikes, which can be prohibitively expensive for a family to buy. So working with schools and community grants to be able to, provide that, whether it's a hand cycle or a tricycle, really to get those students riding with the rest of their class can be incredibly powerful.
I know you brought up earlier trust and social connection as being a big part of what you're doing. And I know that that's something that it seems like parents have concerns and they're the ones that control, especially at an earlier age, if kids are going to be out there and where they're going, those type of things. What kind of things can we do as advocates to support that conversation with the parents about, letting their kids try these things out and then building that trust and support?
Guess I can jump in first, but Megan may have the most kind of on the ground experience here. But I think, part of what we've seen, again, starting with the school program is, it gets started during the school day, and then, parents and community members get a little bit intrigued. They see all those like neon yellow helmets bobbing around, and they're like, "What is this?" And so really that has created a lot of community conversations. And so, part of it is also just, inviting them along when they're able so they can be a part of it and see it in action and experience it for themselves rather than just kind of worrying at home about what's happening with their students, because I think having that actual experience out there with the students, as Megan said, is just there's so much joy and so much power in that that I think that can go a long way. But maybe Megan has more insight on that side.
In terms of building trust, because I've seen this happen so much in the after school um, walking and rolling club that um, I would say 90% of parents end up coming back to me and say, thank you for instilling confidence in my child. I now trust them to go to X by themselves or like it started with them entrusting me to equip their kids with the right skills. And it's a very subversive program for the kids because it's all about the joy, the food, the snacks, the music. And so that's how I build trust with the kids. But then with the parents, it's the what I'm promising that the kids will come away with is the ability for them to get themselves around the neighborhood, the most calm routes, and do it mindfully. And then that in turn instills the trust between the parent and the child. So I don't know how I built trust with the parents. Besides, I mean, I think that getting an LCI, like lead certified instructor status, is a big deal. And then also running a nonprofit that gives free bikes to kids, like, is just kind of instant trust. And I've taught a lot of kids how to bike by telling their parents, I'll get them a free bike, just bring them in and we'll learn in the parking lot together. But yeah, without that, without getting the trust from the parents, it is like it's a hard sell. But I think everybody's capable of doing it.
If
And
I
there
can
was,
add, I
go ahead,
think
Bruce. Mhm.
yeah, I think that maybe sharing stories about what other parents do to support their child's independent mobility. So it comes from regular parents, not researchers who are avid advocates about walking or biking. So in our qualitative research, we've looked into that a little bit, and some parents discuss, allowing their children to cross the streets, but walking behind them a little bit, and then further and further, so that they can witness that the child is behaving correctly. Others discuss having a dog, so the parents may not feel so comfortable letting the child walk on their own, but if they're walking with the dog, sometimes that makes them more comfortable.
And there was a question just asked, what are your feeling towards traffic gardens? If you were funding strapped and the statement of using the real environment, do you favor using real street community infrastructure over a traffic garden type of environment? And I guess I'll ask you that, but my feeling is it really is age dependent. Putting preschool kids on a traffic garden in Washington D.C. and then taking second graders on rides with the schools on city streets, those all work together. But if you're looking towards independent mobility, kids a little older, it may be different. So I'll let you finish up with that. Where do we do the training? Where do we get their experience?
Oh, I mean, Rick, I think it's exactly as you said, especially for younger children, like you don't necessarily want to always fully expose directly to traffic, especially if it's in a heavily traffic or dense area. Of course there are pros and cons to like having that real experience, but I think, to just, really get the feeling for what it feels like to bike, to learn about the science, to navigate, through a traffic environment, even if simulated, I think can be really powerful at those younger ages as you kind of build up the skills and awareness to go out onto the real road.
So I just want to echo what Shane Rhodes said in terms of like the trust building, because I'm a parent of a 16-year-old who essentially grew up on a bike, and I'm also a school district employee. Like there is like that trust there. And then Philip has this question. I know both places you're talking about, Philip, because I have been to Concord and Lowell. I used to be a Bostonian or Cantabrigian, but. Anyway, Public Works I have a really good relationship with our Department of Public Works. Like I can just now have a very casual conversation with him. He's like, oh, that's a no-brainer. We'll do that. Parking's not needed. It's just like so amazing. And then, school district is being a school district employee with a school district email is very valuable.
I think we're at 4 p.m., so I'll turn it back over to you, Allison.
Yeah. Well, thanks. I came
Thank you
on
all.
just at 4. I really appreciate your time today, and I don't want to be too selfish with it. So we will have this webinar. It was recorded, so we'll have it on our webpage, bikely.org/webinar, and on our YouTube page. And I want to just express my appreciation for Megan, Richard, Esther, for your time, your specialty, your insights, all so interesting and so inspiring too. I think we need a world with more kids biking. So thank you so much, and everyone have a great day.
Thank you.